Hello, welcome to VOW, Voices of Wisdom. This show might not be for everybody, but everybody needs to watch this show. This show is generally informative, educational, and sometimes controversial. And I think today is going to be a little bit controversial, but I want you to stay tuned. This is part 2 of The Ordeal, and the subject is the truth lies on the other side of silence. And we're going to be talking about PTSD and PTSS. Let me just give a short definition of the ordeal. A painful or horrific experience, especially a protracted, prolonged one, the ordeal of having to give evidence. An ordeal is something difficult or painful to go through. Something kind of hard, like taking a test, can be an ordeal. But often an ordeal is a serious and long-lasting event, like an illness or tragedy. When you go through an ordeal, you have to deal with something tough, like torment or torture. I'm going to start this show off with what I call art therapy. As you can see, it says slavery. And the reason why I'm showing this, because art therapy is usually a great way of releasing tension and a healing. And I'm just going to read a few things that are derived that are on this art therapy. And then I'm going to tell you who produced this art therapy. Some of the words on here states that I got from, I just told you who it was now, hate mail. And some of the words on this hate mail is on this art therapy. And it says, changing the name of your museum to reflect all races who have suffered and longed on the greatness. Otherwise, you are promoting discrimination against all other races. Stop reverting to slavery, because all it is doing is fueling the anger of those black people who only want to resort to violence. This is what was in this letter that was sent to me. The last thing I'll read was, if you truly want to do good in the state and the city as well as the country, tell black people in your community and beyond to stop killing, hurting other races as well as their own. Opening up a museum to talk about slavery will serve no purpose but to reflect on what black people were in the past. The past is over. Move forward. Selah. We're going to talk about PTSD and PTSS. And before I do that, I was hesitant to do this, but I'm going to make this a little personal. That letter was sent to me. I am the co-founder and the executive director of the Southampton African American Museum located in Southampton. And that letter was sent to me about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I have to tell you, it was very disturbing. And my healing was doing this art therapy. So PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is a mental and behavior disorder that can develop because of exposure to a dramatic event, such as sexual assault, warfare, traffic collisions, child abuse, or domestic violence, or other threats on a person's life. Symptoms may include disturbing thoughts, feelings, or dreams related to events, mental or physical distress, to trauma related to cues, attempts to avoid trauma related to cues, alternatives in the way a person thinks and feels, and an increase to a fight to flight response. Those symptoms last for more than a month after the event. The other topic we're going to talk about is PTSS. That's post-traumatic slavery syndrome. And the difference we're going to talk about is PTSD is generally a one kind of thing that happens, And the PTSS is a ongoing, ongoing, long-term effect. And I have some distinguished people as my guests today, Dr. Georgette Grier-Key and Mr. Carl Johnson. Welcome.
Thank you.
Could you just tell us a little bit about yourself again?
Hi, my name is Georgette Grier-Key. I am the executive director at Eastville Community Historical Society. I'm also a professor and historian, and my work consists of course, preservation, but also I do have other things that I work on as well that consist of art as well. Um, and this was a heavy opening to a show, I must say. I'm feeling a very heavy presence, but I'll turn it over to my colleague here, Carl.
My name is Carl Johnson, Bridgehampton resident for over 50 years. Graduated from Bridgehampton High School, went away to college, graduated from LIU, Southampton College, coached the Bridgehampton basketball team for 26 years. Retired from basketball a couple of years ago, 4 years ago, and I'm still currently employed at the school.
Yes, this is a heavy topic. This is a heavy topic. And the other part of prolonged PTSS or PTSD is prolonged trauma such as slavery, concentration camps, and chronic domestic violence. But the thing I want to really decipher is between one is mainly like in one incident. They could be like indirectly or directly affected. Like you can hear that somebody got hurt and you can feel the trauma from it. But PTSS is more of a prolonged. Georgette, would you explain, could you give us a little bit of what PTSS is? And we know that I guess Dr. Joy DeGoy?
Yeah, Dr. Joy DeGory, she has a book. It's called the post slavery trauma that we revisit as multi-generational, that it's passed down. And what she does is her study looked at two parts of quantitative and qualitatively looked at how slavery has played a part in African Americans' lives, one through how it's been passed down through lived experiences in African Americans' everyday lives, and then second, the way we have dealt with it through mental mental services, which a lot of us culturally have avoided throughout the years. And overcoming some of experiences by adapting how we experience some syndromes through slavery. So a lot of the things within cultural experiences, like for one, you could not get married, so you adapted to not being able to get married. So things that we have done culturally that could be a negative experience, but we don't see it as a negative experience. How we refer to things culturally, like when we refer to boys and men, and we say, oh, that's the little this or the little that, which are internalized throughout time. And the reason that these things are belittled in that way is because whenever the enslaver or the planter came around, we never wanted to kind of glorify the children, because in fear of possibly them being taken away. So we didn't want to glorify that situation. So there's always just a little bit of a bitter pill put on the situation in fear of praising it, because it would be taken away. So that's kind of some of the negativity that you will hear coming, but there's always, of course, pride and praise, but you never let that be seen from the onset in fear that something would be taken away.
It's funny you said that, because I watched something on YouTube this morning in regards to what you're saying, and I also watched a couple of documentaries over the weekend preparing for the show. And it was interesting, they were saying they had a scenario where it was a woman talking about, it was a white woman talking about her son, and the teacher was saying how he was doing so well in school and et cetera, et cetera. And then the black woman, she was, they were praising her son as well, but she was turned around and said, oh, well, he's okay, he's bad at home and whatever. And she turned around and reflected on back in the day in a slave plantation where the slave master, when in the cotton field, came and would say, oh, your young boy is doing well. And they would automatically say something bad about him because they didn't want him to be taken away from them. And it just talking about how this has continued, the mentality has continued, and this syndrome, the slavery syndrome has continued within our community. Some of it that we don't even realize. But then you have, so this is something we need to talk about. And PTSS is something new for most of the people. That's why I feel like I wanted to bring this out today. But why do you think it's such a challenge right now talking about slavery? Why is it such a pushback, you think, Carl?
I don't have a problem with it.
I don't think you do.
We don't have a problem.
We don't have a problem with it.
I think they have really truly politicized it, and when you hear parents talk about it, white parents talk about it, it's like, oh, my kid was traumatized. You heard about how people were brutalized and enslaved, and how they were. Well, I was like, and then they tell your kids, well, we don't want to be taught. We want you just to forget about it. But how can you forget about it when you see a Confederate flag flying by in somebody's truck? They don't want to forget about the Civil War that they lost. So why should we forget a history that, like, my great-great-grandparents went through, or a cousin of mine did our roots, and we went to the plantation where my ancestors were there, and it was kind of spooky. And of course, the owner was like, well, what are you here for? We just came to look. We don't want anything. But that was his first reaction. And then when he realized we don't want anything, because he's probably a relative, but he thought we just wanted to be there. And it's part of American history. It's not just black history. It's a part of American history. And now if they're afraid of it, then that's going to be a problem going forward. There's nothing traumatic about learning about history, especially your own history.
It seems to be even, I guess I'm going to go on both sides. Sometimes even I have some of our people don't want to talk about slavery because it's a shame. But then on the other side, white people don't want to talk about it because it's a fear and guilt.
Well, I think that's semantics, because the reality is not everyone could afford to have enslaved persons. So it's white fragility at its best. So a lot of it is cop-out. I think that we are a country that has normalized violence. I think that if you look at a lot of the games that parents allow their children to play, if it's really traumatized over the violence, the movies, I'm appalled at some of the commercials that come on TV with these, especially during the Halloween time. So if it's really about the violence that is caused, it's ridiculous. He's talking about a plantation. There's weddings on plantations regularly. We don't go to a site of where there was a scene of the Holocaust or any other type of horrific scene and have weddings there. We've normalized slavery in a way where it's supposed to be benign to, us and our ancestors. But any other violent crisis in our country, we haven't talked about it in a way that it is really truthful. And I think that's the first problem. We have to have a conversation about it. We just participated in the first, exhibition about slavery at the Long Island Museum in the 80 years of its existence. And you have people who have lived here all their lives, 80 years old, and saying, I never knew there was slavery in the North.
You still get that.
So, we haven't really had a real overall understanding and conversation and or education about slavery. And it's not about pointing fingers at who did or what, because the reality is, like I said, not everyone could afford to have an enslaved person. So this is not about your feelings and about you or your fragility. This is about the truth, about what happened, and telling the American story, because the slavery we're referring to is uniquely American slavery and not the historic biblical slavery that you read about.
Right.
You know, it's so challenging because here we are in 2021, and we think about, I mean, what comes to me is what the tragedy, how you feel. And this is what we're talking about, the trauma, the post-trauma that's happening. I mean, we for years and years and years since slavery, it's continued and continued and continued. If it, I think about this sometime, I think about it probably too much. If it had stopped, if we haven't had any effect of it, if we still don't see the ramifications of it, or we still see the effects of it now, we wouldn't be talking about this today. We'd be talking about something else, you know.
I mean, I recall when Roots came out. I mean, of course, it was controversial at the time, but it wasn't so controversial. It wasn't. I think everybody was still glued to the TV, black, white. They were still glued to the TV. It wasn't like, oh, it was trauma. It was, it was part of our history, American history. And now all of a sudden, now you can't talk about slavery. You can't talk about anything that has to do with racism, almost like they want to just wipe it right out, which is not going to be wiped out. It's not going to be wiped out. And whether your kids learn it in high school or not, they're going to come across some part of it, whether they go to the higher education. But it's kind of disappointing. It's really, you know, to me, it's like I get frustrated and I get really angry because I'm like, why can't we talk about this? That happened. It happened. It's not like it's made up in our minds.
And that's the thing that you said is funny when you said angry, because they're thinking that we should get over it and we shouldn't have an effect of it. And we've identified sometimes as the angry black woman or the angry man, etc. And those are things that are just very frustrating to me, is that we're challenged. You know, things just keep happening. I mean, we can even go back to the Emmett Till situation and how that affected. I mean, how was that affect? I mean, look at that picture. I mean, there he was, a young, beautiful young boy, and the picture next to him this is what they did to him. This is what, I don't know, was the Ku Klux Klan, white supremacists, whatever you want to call it. But supposedly, this is what I want to talk about with this picture is, supposedly he was sometimes they have a double standard. That's what I want to talk about how a black man could look at a white woman or whistle at her, but at the same time, back in that time, it was almost a given that a white man could have his way with a black woman, and there was no ifs, ands, and buts about it. But look at how that affected a mother. I mean, how traumatic is that
Correct.
as a mom?
Well, you know, like growing up in the South, which I went to a segregated school, and the only way they integrated was they brought in 2 white teachers. I'm like, it's not integration. Like, I even at that point knew that. But we had to, like, you know, my uncles used to tell me the stories, like they couldn't look at a white woman or make any gesture, like, or even say anything that they thought would be in a sexual content, or, you know, even being mistaken for, and or there would be some consequences, period, point blank, and no law was going to ever save them. The local police officer weren't, or the police department was not going to investigate it. And it's just like, oh, that boy deserved, and that's how like I said, it gets frustrating and you get angry, but you control your anger and you use your brain
Absolutely.
to overcome that anger. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that, you know, one of the things that we have to continue to focus on is you have to look at where in our policies and our laws that it still exists. You know, I teach my students that look at the 13th Amendment and you will see that there is still a component of slavery with us. And there are systems that still perpetrate slavery, and we have the new Jim Crow in our jail systems. One of the things that I am disappointed in, that the game keeps changing, the system keeps changing. For one, I'm thinking about just recently we were talking about eradicating student debt, and you find out, oh, this is no longer in the new bill that is being passed. Why? Because 70% of the persons that own the student loan debt is black women. So we keep institutionalizing this new form of black code, slavery in different forms. It keeps, you know, moving and transforming into new systems. But I will say, when we think about this new form of slavery and trauma that passes on, that is never addressed because it keeps hiding in policies. And so we can't get over it. And this whole syndrome, as you said, we cannot pull ourselves up from the bootstraps because there is a such thing as institutionalized and systematic isms, not just, you know, racism, economic oppression, all of these things that are wrapped up in this PTSD, PTSS, that is structural and purposeful, that you can't pull yourself up, one man for themselves. This is also wrapped up in the principles of distributed and concentration, wealth, and power, to make us against one another, to make the ramble, this is what Adam Smith talked about as the VOW maxim. We cannot be one for ourselves, me first and you last, that I am not concerned with my brother and my sister's keeper. We cannot pull ourselves up from the bootstraps. And if we don't bring down these systems of oppression, which is economic, let's not us forget that Martin Luther King Jr. was in Memphis for his march for jobs and justice. This is also against slavery, that we must have economic power too, to demystify slavery, because that's what the system of slavery also perpetrated. So we must have economic power and be able to achieve it too.
But we have liberals that help us, right?
Well, you know what Malcolm X said about liberals. So I just saying, we have to think about all of this.
Let's touch a little bit more on that topic. I want to get a little bit more on, because my take on that originally, before my eyes opened, that liberals were there to help us and help us out. They really wasn't against us. They were our helpers. But at the same time, they kept us in a place where, say, for instance, if, you said you had your GED, they said, oh, that's wonderful. But meantime, they'll make sure their son and daughter's going to an Ivy League school or getting their higher education. But yet, when they're trying to help this community, say they're helping a group of young kids, and the young kids have their GEDs, it's just okay. It's just fine, and they're going to keep it going instead of not accepting that. So the whole liberal thing, my eyes got open many, many years ago about this, benevolence of liberals. Which, anybody else want to comment on that?
Well, liberals, just like Republicans, conservatives, how you want to, whatever you want to call them, it comes down to economics and it comes down to money.
That's it.
That's the bottom line. I don't care what no one says. So we'll keep you happy. We'll throw you a little carrot, a little dangle, and you just keep voting for us. Don't worry, we'll get that bill passed one day. And if that was the case, all these politicians, if that was the case, things would have been changing. And whether you're liberal or not, things would have changed. They would have made it happen. I look at the Senate and I look at the Congress, and okay, if you talk about the popular vote, if that's the majority of the Americans, then why aren't we doing these things that the majority of Americans say? That's the bottom line. So it comes down to economics and money.
I never forget, I had a conversation with a former boss. I'll just leave it at that. And I never forget, because I was always, black power and the black this and black that. And he said that to me one day, He says, Brenda, it's about economics. And at that moment, I didn't receive it because I was still into my militant way of thinking. But finally, it finally hit me. I said, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely.
So that goes back to teaching our kids. Not only we think about what our past has been about, but do we have those curriculum to teach kids how to get credit? No.
Exactly. And that should be taught at a younger
it's not
age.
even taught.
It's not.
I'd rather for my kid to be taught that than to be taught algebra for 4 years.
Absolutely.
Teach him how to gain that finance and the economics. I need that.
I can't take this. We only got 2 minutes left. And so before we close this, I know it's been an intense conversation today, but I want them to put that picture up, that last picture up for me. And I want you to tell me, as a black man, how did you feel when you saw this happening? And I consider this to me, that's a street lynching, you know.
Like the great Malcolm X said, a Cadillac is a Cadillac. It's just different models. That what I see is oppression and showing I still control you, black man. I don't care. People say, well, he was a criminal. He was not. He's a human being. And seeing him put his neck up there and as if it's okay, not flinching. I was really, yes, I was very upset and angry about that. And no one could tell me any different, that this man did not get murdered right in the streets in front of people.
And it's interesting how this happened, during the COVID, everybody was home.
Everybody's home.
But lastly, we have like 30 seconds left, unfortunately. But again, this trauma, this slavery, this is still affecting. Here we are, 2021, and it still affects. This is still affecting us. We need to heal.
Yeah.
We need to heal.
I looked at it and I had a conversation with my son real quickly, and my white friend was like I said, well, you never have the same conversation I had with my son.
That's right.
Period, point blank. You don't. Well, I teach my son how to, respect the law, and I don't. And I was like, in the conversation, I'm done.
Absolutely. This is the end of the show. The truth lies on the other side of silence. It's time for us to tell our story. Thank you.